White House officials today issued a statement regarding abuses of power went to the highest rank of the military. Day of conflict opened with fresh bombing by the insurgents. The world is a heavy place, filled with chaos, darkness, and political espionage. Sometimes you just want to take a breather, have a little bit of fun. So when the season begins for League of Legends, in whatever region you happen to follow the game in, if you want to play some fantasy League of Legends or bet on a game, maybe try eSports pools. Again, no pressure. There's no sort of war will be waged against you. And this revolution will be bloodless, comrade. Now, the West hasn't made the final of Worlds ever in the LCS era. In fact, if you count tournaments called the World Championship, they've never made the League of Legends World Championship final. In 4 years, Europe has had a team in the semi-finals, basically every year's except Season 4 and Season 7. The West has never beaten a Korean team in a best-of-5 at Worlds or MSI. So whatever's been tried so far hasn't really worked out, like the current approach. So if we were trying to somehow construct a team that could have been on this level to win a Worlds or make it to a final, okay, we tried all the current approaches and different thoughts and lines of evolution and development of infrastructure, but what if we could try the super team approach? Because clearly, part of what puts Korea ahead, it's not just having good players. We have good players in the West, but they clearly have cultural advantages or different cultural ambience that in some way perhaps pressures or creates a circumstance where people practice in a different way or practice harder or more efficiently or smarter or learn from each other because there's more good people there. Clearly, having peers around you who push you and are at a high level and therefore you're all competing with each other probably has some impact. So if I wanted to make a team that went into one tournament and had a chance to potentially win it from the West, I'd probably just want to say, to counteract or skip over some of those disadvantages the West has, let's start by getting some of the best players in the West. But then also, it can't just be a team that's an all-star team. We need them to be able to fit together with each other. We need them to be able to train very hard and very diligently, especially because we're going to want them to boot camp in Korea or go to Korea for a few months or have Korean practice partners and therefore play and practice at a very high level. So I would say, what if we made a Western super team? Now, to do so, I will say at the outset, to get all the players who fit my criteria, I can't just go with the current crop of players. I've got to go throughout history, but these are players where if you could have gathered them with a time machine from history, or somehow you could have got them all together in the same time in the same place, like perhaps Season 5, then you could have made this team. And the good thing about it is, first of all, I think it fits the criteria of a super team, because super team is actually a term that a lot of people seem to get confused by, because they think it just means that you think every player in the team has one of the best players at their role. But that doesn't work, actually. Like SK Telecom Season 3 or Fnatic Season 5, these players were only considered best at their role after they'd achieved their success. That's not the way a super team works. A super team is where you get together players who were super players, who were star players before they joined the team. And actually, it says nothing about the outcome. Like many super teams, the majority of super teams in pro sports and in competitive video game competitions fail. Actually, they don't live up to their billing. They aren't more than the sum of their parts. They're less than the sum of their parts in many senses. And actually, teams with, in theory, individually inferior players beat them and perform much better. So to make this a super team, these are all going to be players who were very good, if not the best at their role, before they joined this team. But hopefully when they join this team, would fit together, play off each other well, and therefore then make a team that was a good team and it had amazing players at every position. So I feel like that's often a point that's missed. I also purposely, as a criteria for this super team, tried, and this was actually my main driving criterion, was to have players that have what I see as a Korean mentality. They can practice unlimited amounts of time in a day. They just have a ceaseless, quenchless thirst, drive to be better, to understand more about the game, to want to win, no matter what it means, what the public think of you, what your teammates think of you. They just want to win. They want to get better at the game. They want to continue to push forwards and master their role in the game. And so for some of these players, I've had to speculate, because not every position had a player that clearly stood out that was both good and had that mentality. But some of these players, I'm going off things I know from behind the scenes or even from my interviews. So taking 5 players from all of history in the West, these are the players that I chose to put together. For top lane, because we'll move down the map, I picked Zorozero, the Diamondprox top laner from EULCS Season 3 Summer, who went to Worlds, and then in Season 4, unfortunately, Wild away in NIP, who were a very good team in Europe in practice, but never could get a good jungler for the lands, because all the good junglers they wanted to use were underage, and therefore, twice failed the qualifications, and the first time around was the real killer, because that was obviously the time that they did it when they had... oh no, they did it. They failed twice actually overall, and in this scenario, that spelled the end of his career because unfortunately he didn't go to CLG as he had the offer to. He decided to just go and do school. No one's heard from him since he didn't play competitively after that. So sure, he didn't play for a long time, but first and foremost, one thing I really love about Zorozero is I do think he had the dedication. Actually, I think that until all the things went to shit in NIP, I really think he would have been in it for the long haul. He would have played 3 or 4 years if he'd been at LCS the whole time, compete for the title. He could have gone to Worlds, and he seemed like a guy who was very dedicated. Like, he's one of the few top laners who could play amazing carries in Season 3 when he could play all those AP tops, and AD tops, by the way, and then came into Season 4 where it was all the tanks and the bruisers, and he didn't lose motivation. He actually ground out how to play a fantastically efficient and effective role on those champions as well, and just saw it as a new grind mentality of like, well, I'm going to get tiny edges over other people. So I think he did have the dedication, and in fact, I did reflections with him, or a grilled, or something. I think it was reflections, where I actually asked him along the lines of like, if you put in a Korean team or in this setting where you had to play all day long, do you think you could manage it? And he actually said he could. Now, as I also just alluded to, he's also one of the few Western players who was amazing at both. At carries, you could have him in a team like Diamondprox, where you could have the mid and the top lane just straight up carrying games, 1v1 in their lanes, and he can do that. But you then put him onto carries, you put him onto tanks, you put him on Dr. Mundo, or I'm sure you could have played Maokai, or you put him on the bruisers. Again, put him on Renekton. The guy's fucking fantastic. The guy could really do it all in that sense, and had not only a great mentality for laning and being a carry individually, but also was fantastic at teleporting, at contributing to the shop calling, at thinking about how to tank for his carries, how to be the guy who soaked up the damage. He really just had a great mentality for winning, and part of the reason he was able to adjust to the tanks, as I mentioned, is he had a fantastic mentality for how you have to play the top lane in that era going forwards, which he didn't play beyond that, obviously, but this has been the mentality the top laners have got to have. You can't really have it like, I'm going to Flame Horizon someone straight up, and I'm going to smash them with 3 kills in lane, and then I'm going to take that, and I'm going to apply that pressure to the rest of the map and dominate as a carry. You're not getting to play carries as much. You generally are going to often need to play tanks, especially with the strengths of the other roles during some of the latter eras of League of Legends. So this guy had that mentality of like, well, even if I can get a tiny edge, I can just stay alive in lane with a losing matchup, or I can just get the 30 CS advantage from lane without giving up a kill with a slightly better matchup, and I can actually sometimes let my jungle go elsewhere, therefore pressure is elsewhere on the map, while I can stay safe up here and be self-sufficient, or I can take the jungler and I can get kills here, and then I can convert that with teleport usage, being a great teammate, and being able to then apply that to what we do in the mid game and when we group up as a team. And also was at the same time cocky in a good way, like he was very confident in himself and really believed he and his team could win and should win, but also because he was willing to adapt and continue on with that mentality, wasn't someone who got stuck in his ways as much. Now, admittedly, we don't have as big a data sample size for this guy. We don't have like 4 years of him playing to know how he would have been in later years. Perhaps motivation would have dipped. But if I can get that Zorozero from Season 4, give me that guy. Because even though I love Soaz, I think he's amazing, he's got great ceiling, he's also got flaws. Even though I thought some of the other players in Europe and North America, Poncer, for example, have been very good and have showed levels of excellence, I get the feeling that Zorozero had all the qualities I need for this top lane. And so that's who I would pick, bearing in mind I can go back in time and pick anyone. Now, as my jungler, funnily enough, I'm going to pick Diamondprox, classic jungler of Moscow 5 and Gambit Gaming, who obviously, thanks to the EU LCS and the visa restrictions, hasn't played in the LCS since, I mean, I think it was actually early season... Was it early season 6? I think it was, right? Wasn't it a few weeks of that he played and then couldn't play more? And so, first and foremost, what's the thing you think of with Diamondprox? Not counter jungling, because that's actually just a byproduct of this factor. It's innovation, right? The ability to not only find what's best for a jungler now with items and build paths, and then thinking about what you want to do in the game and how people are playing right now and how the other junglers playing, that's all great. But his ability to see a new way to play the jungle a way that might be the future of the jungle, or might just be your own unique little cul-de-sac that you'll go down for a while, find success, and then pivot out of. This guy, no one's ever really seen the jungle in the way that this guy has. Other people have come along and for a split or for a period of time pioneered a style or a style of vision control or added, tweaked a little bit. But yes, obviously in the early days it was more wide open so he could create more. But his entire career he pretty much found ways to remain relevant, to create new things, to experiment with new things that either ended up being something important or at least taught him something about the game. And it's no surprise to me that throughout his entire career, other junglers, and especially Koreans, always were impressed by this guy and always wanted to watch what he's doing because he was that guy who was coming up with so many ideas, who had that unique perspective on the game. So even if you're a better jungler than him later in his career, you still want to watch what he's doing to first of all try and figure out what's he going for here? How is he thinking about this champion and its interaction with another champion or its jungle pathing? And then even if you don't take that, you want to at least try and glean some of that knowledge, don't you? So funnily enough, he's a guy where I actually think the most underrated aspect of Diamondprox, because as an actual raw jungler, someone who just ganks and who clears his creeps, I actually think he had some massive flaws. And in fact, he almost never ganked the mid lane, for example. And obviously when Genji was there, he just almost never went to the bot lane. Right? Yes, he had some flaws in that sense. But his way of seeing the jungle was so unique that I actually used to love reading any interview with the guy. I did my own reflections with him by the time he could speak pretty good English. His way of like how a certain champion should be used, or what the kit suggests about them, or what an item path means, not just for how you clear or how you gank, but what it might mean later in a team fight, or whether it allows something that otherwise can't be played in the jungle to be viable, which then opens up what it can do in the mid game or in a team fight that, you know, no one else would think of, because they would think, yeah, but it can't do this part in the jungle first. It can't survive through this aspect to get to that point. So they already have a limiter in their mind saying, oh, there's no point thinking about that. It can't do this part here. He could kind of make those creative leaps and then reverse engineer a bridge under himself to get to the point he needed to. And therefore, he would make things seem OP that weren't even OP, actually. They just had a certain utility that you could use at some point in the game, and he knew how to get to that point in the game, as opposed to just thinking, I want the best early game jungler, or I want a scaling jungler, or I want a jungler that ganks, or I want a jungler that farms. He didn't think in such simple, limited terms. And so every time he tried a new build path or tried a new champion, it wasn't even whether it worked or not. You wanted to know why and what he was going for there. And so I feel like if I have this super team of amazing players elsewhere, I want this guy in the team in that sense. And also, along with being daring and, crucially, this is it, willing to fail at his picks and his builds and people to think he's an idiot, part of what's great about that is it actually ties into his internal confidence. When he was at his best, even in the latter seasons when he was still a pretty good player, when Gambit didn't have all the Russian players anymore, he was a guy who didn't seem to feel discomfort in the same way. He could play a new pick he's never played in competitive before. He could play a pick that everyone else thinks is going to fail or has a very difficult sort of spike that he has to get to in the game by going through a trough. And somehow that didn't make him like lose all faith or crack or crumble, which is one of the other things that stops a lot of these top pros who are amazing and maybe even used something in scrims or in practice from being able to get this execution on a new pick, an experimental idea into the game. So you add that in and put him against Koreans and put him against top level competition with good lanes. And I think he wouldn't be someone who lacked for confidence at all. I think he would be somewhat Forgiven-esque in thinking, well, I'll be the best jungler in the world. Fuck these Korean guys. Yeah, they might have Faker and they might have Mata and they might have all these great players, but I can be the best jungler. I can tell you that, because guess what? Jungle isn't this raw mechanical role, and I can have the best mind for the game. I can outthink these guys, and I've got my amazing laner, so we're going to fuck these guys up. I think he would have a fantastic mentality in that sense, and I think he was only really humbled by the end because he knew he wouldn't play in top teams and he wasn't going to play with the best players. And as a result, I think the big problem with jungle is when you put junglers that are even very good junglers, I saw this with Dandy when he was in Vici Gaming, when you put them with players who aren't that good as their laners, they actually do start naively sometimes to compare themselves to other junglers and think, oh, well, he's having success, maybe he's better than me or whatever. But actually, you look at the team and he just had way better tools to work with. So he would definitely be my pick for mentality, for his innovation and his ability to see the game. So I can also bank that he can be relevant in future splits and future seasons. And crucially, he has a special type of confidence that very few Westerners have ever had. A lot of them have said in interviews, haha, I will clap Faker. Oh, I think we can win worlds, guys. Let's see if you can guess all these Easter eggs. Or, you know what, I think this time we can actually get out of groups. Bay life, you know, like it doesn't matter what they say on camera. I can tell you, in private, a lot of these guys are just like, oh, I just hope we get out of groups. Oh, it's going to be tough against them, but we'll do our best. Like, it wasn't going that well in scrims. This is a guy where he legitimately did think he could beat Koreans. He believed it was possible. Obviously, he did earlier in his career when they were still very good, but not as developed in terms of infrastructure. And I think that's actually a key mindset to have for this kind of a super team. Now we'll go to the mid lane. And for the mid lane, I've actually chosen Bjergsen. And the reason why I've chosen Bjergsen, because there's many players I could have chosen here, many EU mid laners for that matter, right? Could have chosen classic Expeke, a guy who didn't seem to show fear when he played against Koreans and would try to outplay them just as they tried to outplay him, and played somewhat to his ceiling, which was very streaky, but if he hit it, was fantastic, and he was something of a virtuoso at those assassins. Obviously, the way his mind worked clearly aligned with the way assassins function in the game, in the splits where you could play those. I didn't pick Froggen, my favourite, someone who I've always respected because he can always find a way to be relevant in the game. No matter who his teammates are, no matter how the game's going, he will craft a win condition, he will play to that, and he will try to execute as well as he can. One of the best laners of all time. I didn't pick any of these players. I picked Bjergsen, and the reason I picked Bjergsen is because, like those other guys, he has a fantastic skill level. He has a deep champion pool. He has been very relevant over all the splits domestically. But here's the key reason, is because while I do think that Expeke was driven by competitive drive. Like, if he got to the tournament and to the playoffs, yes, I think he was pumped up then, but he didn't practice as much before then. He was laissez-faire in terms of dedication to being great every single day. Froggen has that dedication, but he hasn't shown that he can play with all types of teammates necessarily. He can be somewhat stuck. The positive of him finding the win condition is that he constructs a way that he can be relevant, but he hasn't always been as adaptable to playing around win conditions from other players in his team, or just being a contributor when it's not the right game for him to be the guy trying to carry or to go late game or to scale up or to just farm rather than push elsewhere on the map. He has been a little bit more resistant in that sense. So actually my main reason I would pick Bjergsen is because even though I haven't always seen it from him, I do believe that if he had the superstar teammates and he had the right team and they were all practicing and they were going to Korea and they had this amazing mindset and they really thought they could go for number one, I think he would be the most adaptable mid. And the reason I say that is because I think he is very individually driven. And that's one of the things from talking to him and from reading all the interviews with him and watching his career that I've been most impressed by. It's not about his skill level or the fact that he wins the MVPs or that he can always win LCS, etc. No, it's not about that. And in fact, it's not about the fact that he failed on the world stage or didn't always have the great games there. No, but what I've seen from him is I really do think that Bjergsen always wants to get better. And a lot of people pay lip service to that and they don't actually deliver on it in the actual practice server or in games. I think he legitimately does strive to be better all the time and think it's possible to be better all the time. And I actually think, low-key, he won't ever say this publicly, I think he does try to be the best League of Legends player who ever lived. I really think in that sense he's like LeBron James, where unlike many other great players, including Kobe, etc., even if they had the potential, and that was really the trajectory they were aiming for, was to be the best player ever, they didn't want to be the guy who said that. Definitely not publicly anyway, because then people would think that arrogant, etc. And so I know behind the scenes, Kobe, when he was young, did say this sort of thing. But LeBron, one thing I can respect about him is he really has put that pressure on himself, as well as others doing it, from day one. And this has happened to Bjergsen. And I feel like they thrive on that and they want that pressure. And maybe they don't always live up to it, but they want that. It's driving them forwards because they do think it's possible to be the greatest ever. And I think that when you talk about the mid lane, in my opinion, the most influential role in the entire game, if you look at the history of who wins championships and which superstar player is the best to build around, it's mid lane. So Bjergsen not only can fulfill all my mechanical needs, but I think his mindset is really, really key. And I also think, aside from this current TSM lineup, which admittedly his jungler kind of deserted him for the last year or so and his team never found a way to integrate the jungler, aside from that, I actually think a lot of the NA teams, even though TSM won NALCS and they finished in the finals all those times, I think a lot of those teams, too much was asked of Bjergsen. He was the clear carry, the clear star. Others at times could be good, but then fell apart. While Turtle, obviously you think of Lost Boy falling apart towards the end, Santorin, amazing, very up and down, Dyrus like really reamed out by the end of his career. I also think a lot of Bjergsen's bad habits that he's now tried to break in the latter seasons came from being that lone carry, that guy where too much was asked of him, and he was to some degree propping up or overly forced to carry other players where he should have had a better supporting cast around him. So I think if you give him this superstar cast, and especially some of these players I think would even absolutely sync up with him mentally, especially my top support and possibly jungle, I think he would thrive and he would love it, because I think he is someone who responds really well to other self-actualized people who know who they are, they know what they want, they're willing to put aside all the limitations and boundaries and hurdles in their way to go for those goals and not give excuses. And if you're that kind of player, Bjergsen's going to thrive on that, and he's going to love playing with you, and he's going to play to you, and he's going to let you play around him, and it's going to be a real team. It's not just going to be either Bjergsen has to carry or Bjergsen has to play a wave clear. So I actually think that these sorts of players he would relate to, he would spur on, and this would probably bring out, in my opinion, the best Bjergsen. Now for my bot lane, not a bad fucking top half of the map, is it? For my bot lane, I'm going to pick AD carry Forgiven. Now the reason I'm picking Forgiven is this guy has the highest level of mechanics any Westerner has ever shown. There's others who can counter him and who maybe are as good as him, and people who maybe even were better AD carries despite his mechanics at certain splits. But mechanically, he's the top. And I actually think mechanically, I don't care who you pick from Asia. You can pick Imp in his prime. You can pick Bang in Season 5. You can go ahead and pick Uzi any split you want. They are only as good as Forgiven mechanically. Now, they might have had deeper champion pools at times. They might have been more willing to play a different way. Uzi not as much. He really did demand the team play around him. But Forgiven's right up there in terms of raw ability. So at a position that can have a massive impact on the game, especially is going to have a huge impact on the mid to late game, which when we're playing against Koreans, it's hard to win those games early. And so you're going to get drawn into those mid to late game scenarios, and you're going to have to team fight at times. I want someone like Forgiven because he can already meet my initial criteria where I'm not at a disadvantage. I'm not having to play around some other win condition before I even get to that position. Also, he is a guy who has an unreal confidence. Like when I talked about the confidence of some of those other guys, I've never met anyone who had the raw confidence, like true belief in himself, like Forgiven did in the League of Legends world. Like he really does believe that if he isn't the best AD carry in the world, he could be the best AD carry in the world. And he does believe that if he had the right team around him and the right circumstances, he would be the best AD carry in the world. It wouldn't matter if you had Uzi and Bang and Prey and Wei Zhao out there. By the way, people he respected, he respects them because he sees things that they do that he thinks is good and it's the right way to play. But he respects them in as much as he wants to play them, and then he wants to fucking crush them and humiliate them. This isn't just some sort of WWE promo that sounds super cool when you say that and you're trash talking for fun and for the fans. That guy actually believes that in his mind. And so with his ability level, and if he had this support in lane and this team and these circumstances, he would have a shot at that. And unlike most other Westerners, I think he's one of the few players in the West who could then potentially go that extra step and be the best player in the world at his role. Just like I thought in the past people like Froggen had a chance to. Their problem is, obviously for any of the mid laners, it's almost unfair to say you could be the best, because even if you had the perfect circumstances, there's Faker, isn't it? The ultimate outlier. So the difference is the other roles you maybe could one day be the best in the world at without having to hope Faker sort of breaks his wrist or has a terrible team around him. So Forgiven's very key in that particular sense. He also, one of the most underrated aspects of him is he's known to be the guy who wants to pressure his lane all the time, to smash his lane all the time, to take his tower all the time, to contest every CS. People know that about him. But what people don't seem to bring up when they talk about Forgiven, because they think he's just Doublelift, that he wants to 2v2 smash lane, and then somehow he's going to hope that that turns into something mid to late game, and then he doesn't die in team fights. That's kind of Doublelift's mentality. Whereas actually, Forgiven, once he gets out of 2v2, where yes, he's a specialist, and he's a fucking artist in the lane, but has a very stubborn mentality, you have to play around him, he has an unbelievable understanding of what to do in team fights. When you get to those team fights, he is outrageously good at playing efficiently, like constantly taking every advantage to do damage and to output a lot onto the enemy and to potentially win the team fight, which he calculates well, his targets. But also, he's the best AD carry I've ever seen outside of Asia at being able to calculate how to be efficient in as much as you don't put yourself at undue damage. You don't allow yourself to be killed too easily without giving yourself, without it meaning that you're in a position that could give you a chance to do a lot of damage and win the fight for your team. He's also so amazing at dodging because he's anticipating what the enemy will do, how they will try to attack him, how the tank will try to get onto him. He's so good at calculating that I also think if you could ever unlock a little bit more shot calling out of him in these scenarios, I actually think that's where he could have unleashed his last level and gone Super Saiyan level 10 or whatever the fuck. I didn't watch that TV show. So
that's a very underrated aspect. And with this team I've got here, Zorozero on a tank, or Diamondprox playing something special, Bjergsen obviously available. This guy could do so much in this team. Now, my last player, my support player. Now, if we're going through all of history, there's a lot of players I could have gone with here. Could have gone with Special. If I wanted to just go with the brain side of things and give up some mechanics, I could go with N-rated at different points in his career. Yellow Star, obviously. I think a fantastic shot-calling presence. I love his mind for the game. I think he's very humble, but still plays in amazing teams at the same time, has great read for the game. But I'm actually going to go with someone who has been my pick for a long time, including the days when it wasn't popular to say he was the best Western support. And that is going to be Mithy. Now, it's hard to pick supports for this because there's not many supports can be truly elite every split because the meta shifts are so hard and that role gets wrecked by that, and also you're very dependent on another position. The only role I think is comparable is jungle, because again you can be dependent on other positions and the meta switches can completely wreck your strength and make you have to sort of just paddle and tread water for a while until the meta switches back again, as people like Sword Art and Ignar have shown us in international tournaments. So I will admit this role is harder to pick from. And that's also, by the way, why I didn't pick Special, who I think is amazing, but did lose motivation at certain points in time. And so I also feel like his communication was a bit passive-aggressive sometimes, so I don't know if I want that necessarily. The reason I picked Mithy is because even in the hard times in NIP, even when earlier in his career, before he got onto top teams, he was playing on shit internet, satellite internet, with like 120 ping to mainland Europe from the fucking Canary Islands, this guy ground. And he kept going, and he was willing to play in bad circumstances, to still play a lot, and to try and get better at the game, and to do everything he could to master the game. And then when he got his chances, to go ham at those, and to practice a lot there, and to have the mentality that we can get better, and we got to learn more, and that we're not good enough yet, and that even if we're good now compared to Westerners, well, we're shit compared to the Koreans, and we got to get on their level, and we've got to battle to learn from them, and we've got to learn from all the different great players that we play in the boot camps at these worlds. I think he has an amazing mentality, which can sometimes, in his speech, sound negative, but actually that's just kind of his idiosyncrasy. It actually is a very healthy, very positive mindset towards improving and to never resting on your laurels, and he's amazing for that. And so I think he is a guy, as a result of his past and that mentality, who would sacrifice for greatness. Like, I don't know if he could practice 14 hours a day, but I think if I told him, you only have to do it for 6 months, I'll give you a month off every now and then, I think he could do it. And I think with this sort of a team, it would pump him up to go for that one last run and to really go all in on it. Finally, he can also fulfill some of the shot calling. He has a fantastic read on the game. He is amazing at knowing what his lane can do and then what they can transition out of that, and when the top laner needs to come in or the jungler needs to come play with them. He also is amazing in terms of raw knowledge of the game, as in famously he does not only know his role and how the AD carry should play and how the jungler and top lane should interact with him. This is one of the few players I think in the West who I legitimately could say would at least have a shot at knowing all the matchups in the other lane, at knowing how the overall comp should work, what's going wrong in the game, and therefore how we should adapt to it. I think he would be one of the best for that, and so I want him as my brains in the team, and he also will take up a lot of the burden that otherwise I would have to put on a coach. So having him here means I can lessen my requirements for the coach somewhat, and I think that's a massive positive, because a big issue putting together a Western super team is coaching is so difficult to gauge in the West, and teams that have won didn't necessarily have the best coaches, and there's plenty of teams that never won who I think had some of the best coaches I've ever seen from talking to them. So coaching would be an issue. So generally, by having Mithy, by having Diamondprox, by having very self-motivated laners, I feel as though coaching would be less of an issue for me, because I'm going to pick a more hands-off coach. Maybe I'm going to have a Daylor or someone along these lines who play more of the keep people motivated, keep people on track, have little goals for how they're going to practice, when they're going to practice. But generally, we're going to have the really genius analyst work with Mithy, work with Diamondprox, and they're going to construct the game plan. The coach is just going to enforce the practices, keep that running, keep people disciplined, keep people motivated, and we're just going to feed the info to the players. And perhaps we're going to have a psychologist or a motivational coach just to keep them on track. But generally, coaching is going to be to support these players, not teach them or craft them or direct them in a certain direction. No, it's just going to be to keep them all at their peaks, keep them all motivated, healthy, practicing a lot, and with no sort of intra-team difficulties. And you know what? I know this is an imaginary team. Obviously, this team couldn't really exist except for maybe a brief period in Season 5, and then even then I'd have to get Bjergsen from NA and put him with these EU players. But I think this team would have a shot. I think it has the pieces to be good in all the roles. I think it has the pieces to work well together. Diamondprox can gank top all the time. Bjergsen has played without a jungler for a long time in some senses. Doesn't necessarily need raw vision. The bot lane's amazing and would interact with Zorozero fantastically. Mithy already has the established history there. Mithy, I think, would be the perfect support for Forgiven. He really could live up to what Forgiven demands of his supports, and with Forgiven, they could transition their advantages out of the bot lane to either allow the more map pressure from their team, or they could just play fantastically safe in the bot lane. They're not going to lose, and therefore leave the top side of the map to do what they need to do. I think Bjergsen would be loving a team with these sorts of players in it. Other carries elsewhere, other tanks elsewhere, people who can provide the shot calling, and he can just be the superstar mid laner, just trying to get CS advantages and trying to sometimes win out with a losing matchup. I think this team would have a shot at it, at least of all the Western teams I can think of.
Hey, this is Cap, and you're watching Thorin, the only man besides Richard Lewis who somehow found a way to get both League of Legends and Dota Redditors to hate him.